Welcome to the Voice of Thai podcast, a space for stories, insights, and conversations that uplift the profession of teaching and inspire positive change in international schools. For over 40 years, the International Educator has served this community through recruitment resources and a dedication to amplifying the voices of international educators around the world. All right, I'd like to welcome listeners back to the Voice of Thai podcast. We have two special guests today, Sammy Jamal and Sam Caras. Caras. I swear, yeah. I just was listening to the Bad Bunny Super Bowl, so now we're gonna get a time element to this. So like in my head is all Spanish.
As it should be.
So you get to be Sam Caras.
Podemos hacerlo en español si es que ustedes quieran.
Oh, sí, mucho gente. All right. For our Spanish-speaking listeners, as well. Getting back to the topic at hand, besides Bad Bunny and the Super Bowl, I want to thank you both for joining us. I asked you and approached you a little while ago if you would come and you would speak with me and our listeners about what you're seeing as counselors who really support and help students figure out like what's their next step post high school and where are they going. So I think a little bit of context that many of us are aware of is that there have been a lot of geopolitical events happening that are perhaps having people look at what are those choices going to be. And we just want to learn a little bit from you. But before we get started, I'd really love to hear a little bit about each of you and what sort of took you to where you are and what you're doing and the work that you're really kind of passionate about. And Sam, let's start with you. Like, tell us where you are. Tell us a little bit, like in 90 seconds or less about how is it that you ended up doing what you're doing, where you're doing it.
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. So as many people do, I fell into international education a little bit on accident. After graduating university, went off to do the Aga Khan Development Network Fellowship and started working in the Aga Khan schools. So I've been really lucky that actually just springboarded my career and just led into, just starting to work with students and supporting them and learning about everything from high need Halley students to just students from kind of all over the world at really unique school systems into what we all do now, which is, international counseling all around the world. So I've worked in India, Kenya, Ecuador, and now the Philippines. So I think I've seen a good chunk of the world now. And so I'm excited to be chatting with you here.
All right. Thank you, Sam. And Sammy.
Yeah. Well, I started my teaching career in Toronto, Canada, and then I went abroad for like a 1-year contract and really fell in love. Came back to Canada, tried it out again, and then that following year applied to a career fair, the Surge Associates Career Fair, and landed in Panama. And I taught there, and that's when I transitioned into counseling, did my master's. And our model was at the time a comprehensive model. So I was mostly doing social emotional initially as a transition counselor in ninth grade. And then, I was really jealous of all the action that the college and university counselors just meeting with different reps. And we moved into a comprehensive 9 to 12 model where I got that opportunity to engage with universities and higher ed. I've worked in Canada, Turkey, Panama, and Chennai, and also Vientiane, Laos. So that's where I've worked.
Well, two connection points that the three of us share is we've all worked in India because I worked in New Delhi. Sam, where did you work in India?
I was in Hyderabad.
Okay, I was in New Delhi, and then we've all worked in Spanish-speaking America at some point. So it's something we always a lot of, crossovers in those of us who've done this and been in 4 or 5 countries. Well, again, I want to thank you and I welcome you to this conversation because I'm really curious. What really kind of sparked this is I was sitting in a PTC counseling course that was about college counseling. And I was there just for technical support, just kind of running the background and the breakout rooms and things like that. And I haven't been in those courses before. Like I have taught a PTC course, but I've not been taking some of the other PTC courses, and they were talking about this topic exactly. And I was like, this is something that it's really fascinating because it's such a change and it feels like a rapid change, like, within what, a year, a little bit, maybe more than that. Maybe some trends have started, before
Hmm.
that. But I really wanted to hear from you both about kind of what you're seeing and really what your students, are experiencing. I think international schools are for many families. Yes, they may serve you if you are outside of your home country, but many of our schools have a lot of local students in them that are using and seeking our schools, not using, but seeking our schools for some of the opportunities they offer post high school outside of their home country, perhaps. So I'm curious as to what you all are seeing in terms of like where are students starting to look? Are you seeing shifts? Let me be more concrete in my question. Like, are you seeing shifts in where kids are starting to look in the past 18 to 20 months? Like, yes or no? And why do you think those shifts are? Sammy, we'll start with you this time.
Yeah, sure. Um, yeah, I recently came across some data that we wanted to share with our board, and I had to do a triple take. I've only been at my school for a year and a half, so I'm still learning, and so I don't have a lot of that institutional wisdom yet. But I did a triple take when I learned that, 90% of our students matriculated to a country where they had citizenship. Um, Now, that being said, thinking of our demographics, the vast majority of our students, 50% are South Korean. We have Japanese, American, European, then some Indian nationals. And if you look at all of those nations, they have high quality institutions. Um, the students, the 10% that were looking abroad were primarily Indian nationals who were, looking for selective, highly selective universities in the US. And I think that was probably their main reason for enrolling in an American international school was the access to, higher education in the US and to take, AP courses to support that. So yeah, I had a triple take because it sounds like it feels like a lot more students are staying where they're familiar and comfortable, and their parents prefer that. So while they study in international schools, they go back home where they have residence or where they have citizenship to study.
And what about you, Sam? What are you seeing at your school?
That's really interesting, Sammy. My school's definitely a little bit different.
Mm,
We are a British school, but we're in the Philippines, so it's interesting because the Philippines has really strong U.S. ties, and people in the
mm.
Philippines have a lot of family. There's a lot of strong ties to the U.S., but we're at the British school, so I was like, oh, I wonder when I started working here, what that was going to be like. But we've got 54 nationalities on campus, and pretty consistently, if I looked at the data, this is my third year here, we had about 30% of our students go to the UK, 30% going to the US, and then 30% divided around the rest of the world, with very, very few students staying in the Philippines. So
Mm.
really heading out, spreading very wide to that other third. Last year, our matriculation changed by the 10% of the kids that would have normally gone to the US flipped to the UK. So we did lose 10% to the US. That pretty concrete. And then this year, as I'm looking at our data, we still have about a third of students who have the US as their first choice in our junior class. And we just did the data for our sophomore class as well. So about a third still. So the interest in terms of applying is actually still around the same, but the
Yeah.
matriculation is changing.
That's
Mm.
really that's really interesting to me. That's a little bit different than I thought I might hear.
Mm.
From your two schools, examples and based on the data. Sammy, yours doesn't surprise me as much. I knowing your school and knowing who you serve and having been in schools that also serve a high percentage of South Korean students, they do typically tend to return,
Mm.
back to South Korea. Do you also graduate a lot of your students mid-year that turn around and go back a little bit early in their senior year, or do they stay the whole time?
They try to stay, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but we always had a number of students who would return in the middle of their senior year in order to prep
Mm.
for South Korean universities. So when you think about the conversations that you're having, even though the data might not be changing, are some of the conversations looking a little different? Are kids starting to open up and consider places or talk about places that maybe they didn't before? Sam, we'll start with you this time.
Yeah, and I think the data is changing just in like a different way. It's not necessarily changing in terms of we still have a lot of interest in applying, but that interest is changing in terms of um, maybe their second and third choice countries, I would say. And I would say that the shift is like not going to the US, but going to US universities. And I think there's a difference in
Mhm.
that. Like there's not, it's not like a country thing, it's maybe a universities thing. Sorry, now I just lost track of your question because that's just me. I just went off on a tangent in my own brain.
No,
Um,
I was just wondering, like, are even if maybe some
the
of the
conversations, right?
data isn't shifting, are some of the conversations? I think what I'm really curious about is, you
Yeah.
know, has some of these changes and these geopolitical things, is it putting up different things for consideration, even though may not be following through with it? Are they starting
Yeah,
to think about other things?
oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, we're seeing a lot of students looking towards staying closer to home as well. Like, even though there might still be interest in us, we're seeing a lot of growth in terms of staying in Hong Kong or going to Australia, kind of being a little bit closer. And I think that's also like post pandemic plus geopolitical situation. Um, I also hear words like, even if people aren't mentioning like political climate, they're saying things like safety or racism or Asian hate and like using those kinds of buzzwords in the conversations and like looking more closely at like city safety and changing that in terms of not oh just this country or just this country, but being much more specific, even if they are looking at the US, about only looking at certain states or
Right.
being more intentional with that. And I think that the conversation has really shifted to for those kids that are even considering the states, they're saying something like, well, what would make it worth it to go to the states? And
Mm.
so what that has done for my students is that means like, oh, this is partially price and partially this conversation of what makes it worth it in terms of that prestige and that social capital. So it's if a school's a top ranked school or it's an Ivy League university in the US,
Yeah.
families are like, oh, it's worth it. I'm able to risk being in the US and overlook maybe what's happening if it's a top US university because they're optimistic that in 4 years, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years from now that name is going to still hold that weight for them, or it's still going to hold that weight for them and their families or their communities or in the countries where they're looking to be hired. Um, but that also means that a lot of people's kind of lists have changed. That conversation has changed from having a balanced list to having, okay, a handful of these I hate that word, but whatever, schools.
Yeah.
Um, and then the rest of
Elite
the schools,
universities.
yeah, elite universities, and then the rest of them kind of being in different countries because it's that questionable. When is it worth it for me to go to the States, given everything that I'm hearing or seeing?
So yeah, if I can get in one to the, let's call it highly selective
Highly
universities, if I can get
selective,
into a highly selective university, that might be worth it. But maybe some of
highly
those,
rejective. Yeah.
like, yeah, or some of those middle selective universities, there maybe not as many on the list
Yeah, I
or
think those
under
are the ones that are
consideration.
suffering.
That's really, which means that like the implication to that is knowing that very few kids get into the highly selective
Yeah.
universities. The implications are you may see different places kids going at the end of this year as they've changed the composition on their list.
Exactly. And that's what I think I was trying to get to with maybe the when we are tracking right now for our years 11, 12s, and British systems, our sophomores and juniors, we're seeing maybe that where they want to apply hasn't changed much, but where they're matriculating is.
Yeah.
Right. So there's fewer students matriculating to the US, even though the numbers of applications going are still fairly similar. And again, that is because the composition of the list has changed due to what they're willing to,
Yeah. So Sammy, for your kids in Chennai
Mm.
who are looking at, maybe their home country isn't the priority and they're, I'll go to Asia, I'll go to Australia and New Zealand, I'll go to the United States, I'll go to Canada. Like, do you see some of the similar things going to Sam, or do you have some different things going on there with your students?
Yeah, so it's interesting because students, so from that group of, Korean students or South Korean students or Indian students, or students from different nationalities that I think there was a time where more of those students from those groups applied to the United States. And I think they are now looking for spots or looking for selective universities in their where they have citizenship. And it's interesting because this is the second year in a row where I've had students disclose anxiety around school shootings or campus shootings.
Mm.
Um, and and then I've had a student last year who was accepted and then come in and share that they were really struggling and feeling anxious about entering the United States because they had, liked or engaged with a pro-Palestinian post, a post about Palestine.
Oh, wow.
And she spent the week trying to scrub her, her socials and try to get rid of any digital imprints, but it was she was really anxious and paranoid about that. So that's been coming up for us, which we've never experienced before.
When I
Um,
think about the way that in so many international schools we would applaud students
mhm.
putting their belief around an issue out there, whether it's like it went on their socials or whether it was a part of like, how they demonstrated some academic learning. Like in a lot of our international schools, we would really applaud that. And now that student is going, okay, I've done things like that. Like I'm passionate, I'm committed, and I want to have a say.
Yeah.
And having to think about the consequences in a way that we always say whatever goes online is forever, but we usually mean it around different things than
Yeah.
your like social and political beliefs. It's more around like your behaviors that may get out there on the internet that you don't want people to know about.
Yeah, and even parents, it's a struggle for parents because parents who are socially conscious, they've shared with me that they've had to advise their children to not engage with causes or even be neutral, and it really goes against their own values. And so just out of fear, and I think that and parents struggle to have those conversations with their students, but with their children, but they're starting to have those conversations. Um, and yeah,
So I want to peel back, a little bit of a
yeah.
layer on this onion because there's geopolitical and there's obviously things going on in the United States, but I live in the Netherlands. And so
Hmm.
I get a lot of Dutch news about universities and there's so many kids who want to go. They want to go because they have English universities. Well, they're
Yep.
now starting to talk about cutting back on letting the number of foreign students come in. They're mandating that more of their programs move to Dutch. Great Britain, another place that a lot of kids go, is talking about limiting
Yep.
for number of foreign students in the country. So you've got, initially this highly desirable area that a lot of people have wanted to go for a long time, them reconsidering that location. You have these other locations that are also highly desirable who are now trying to reconsider foreign students. Like, so when you get down to that next layer, like what are you seeing and hearing? And am I sharing information that's widely known in the counseling circles as well about like it's becoming more restrictive in some of the countries our kids want to go to as maybe their plan A or their plan B. Sammy, I'll start with you this time.
Sorry, Sam or Sammy, our same
Oh,
name
Sam,
situation.
we'll start with Sam. Sam started talking first.
Thank you. Um, yeah, I think widely talked about in the counseling community. I think. I mean, Sammy and I were both at CIS together this year, and I think there were some sessions on that in some countries trying to also like universities trying to reassure us on one hand, but also be realistic. Um, and so I think that that's what's happening. Our jobs as counselors. I mean, when I'm meeting with parents, I'm also saying, okay, we're not going to just sound the alarm because of what the media is saying. Everybody are going to take this as a piece of evidence or a piece of the conversation that we're supposed to have. And I think the impact that's having on the practice and the bliss building is so many more countries. Because of that uncertainty. I mean, we really try and tell students like you can only go to one place. You can't plot. You can't go to 20 different countries. So you've got to narrow that down. But right now, there's so much uncertainty in so many different places. And so that's affecting where people want to apply, how many schools they want to apply to, which countries, because they're like, well, things can change in 6 months' time. How do I know that from the time of application to the time of matriculation, the situation is going to be the same, where I'm going to be welcome, or there's not going to be a political change? And we also see that with things like there's early decision in the US, but then there's, oh my gosh, what if I can't get my visa, but I have to withdraw my other applications, but the country's on a different timeline? How can I protect myself and my future and think about all these things and all these country timelines when I don't know if I'm going to have my housing in one country, a visa in the other country, there's an election for the third one. There's just so many things that they're navigating all at once.
Sammy, are you seeing similar things?
Yeah, so I've noticed there's been a lot of buzz probably in the last 2 to 3 years about private institutions in Germany, Spain, Italy, France. And so and this year actually was the first year the interest is now there's buzz, but now there's students actually applying. So I've seen more applications, more interest to Spain, Italy, France, and Germany. So in the past, I think students who were thinking the UK are now thinking about the other private institutions in Europe. I think students that were considering, um, I'm also seeing in for Asia, even for our Korean students considering Hong Kong as an option, Japan is an option, Singapore is an option. That's fairly new. And I feel like back in the days, maybe 10 years ago, Sam, if you remember, the Netherlands did a great job with marketing their institutions. And there was lots of exposure and they were very visible. And I think now a lot of our families are aware of the housing crisis and what's happening there. And so they're looking for different options in Europe. And our Asian families, because the Korean applications are getting really competitive, especially if you're applying to the Sky universities, the most highly selective schools in Korea, they're looking for other options outside of Korea. And so Japan, Hong Kong, and Hong Kong, I feel like is doing an excellent job with marketing their programs to our students. So there's a lot more buzz, especially with our Asian students, about Hong
Yeah.
Kong.
Yeah,
That's
I was going to say, sorry to cut you off, but I totally agree. We just ran our data for our sophomores, and we saw that for the first time, Asia, in terms of mostly Hong Kong and Singapore, was actually higher than the US in terms of numbers, not in terms of first choice destination, but in terms of we asked the families like first choice, second choice, third choice destinations. We were talking about IB subject selection and alignment and things like that. And so we just tallied the ones that were on those three lists. And actually, Hong Kong and Singapore as one group overtook the US for the first time in that interest. So really, that's definitely growing. And Japan as well. Japan is really growing. Like there's a lot more programs in English and they're really getting out there and traveling. I think that that's really interesting, especially with the cost being really favorable at the moment for students. And also
I was
seeing Spain as well.
I was reading that this is like a strand in Japan's national population increase, that like if they have universities and they can get more people to come to Japan, study in Japan, maybe learn Japanese, maybe stay in Japan because of their declining like workforce, because of their declining population, that this is a part of a national strategy in Japan to combat, population loss, which I thought was really fascinating. Years ago, I took a class that was actually taught. People are going to kill me for not remembering his last name. His first name was George. He was like one of the founders, of the IB. And this was, I mean, this must have been like 10, 15 years ago. And they were talking about what to expect and see. And you see it with like NYU, Abu Dhabi. This all came out of the context of like the Gulf
Mhm.
War and, it was being harder for kids from the Middle East to get visas to go to Canada, to get visas to go, to the United States and Great Britain. And that they were saying that a lot of these named universities might start to have more local campuses. And I think there's somebody in Singapore, I can't remember who, but I know there's like NYU, Abu Dhabi. that conversation started 15 years ago, and you see a couple of these established. Like, I mean, let's face it, college is business, right? Like you may not be for profit, but even nonprofits make money, like, and they have to pay for people, and they have these bazillion dollar, endowments. Like, have you seen more of these like name recognition colleges in different locations around the world? And do you think a strategy that, kind of like the Harrows, and the different school, they've done it in international schools. Like they've taken their name from their private school, licensed it, and spread it around to multiple schools. Do you think that that could happen with like high brand name universities?
I mean, we're seeing that in India, where there are, especially within the UK, there's a lot of UK universities looking to have a satellite campus in India, in the major cities, and so that's something that's come up, um, and they're working through. So that, yeah, absolutely, I can see that happening, and I can see that happening in Singapore. I can see a lot more satellite campuses throughout Asia and China. Definitely a trend. Yeah.
Yeah, I think we definitely see this happening all over the place. I mean, it started obviously at the first one that I learned about was NYU Abu Dhabi when I visited them like a decade ago. But I mean, even just Education City in Qatar with all of those universities, even
Right.
just Lancaster now in Germany with Leipzig, even just all of the British and Australian universities popping up in Malaysia.
Yep.
Temple University
Mm.
in Japan, like offering a degree that's so much cheaper, but like still a US degree. I mean, those are all very attractive options and coming up a lot in our conversations because um, I think that leads me to think about what is this type of education versus where the education institution is located. And those aren't, the same. Like if you can have the best of both worlds, we'll get excited about that. Why not?
So, Sammy,
Yeah.
you were talking about just sort of the anxiety that you were
Mhm.
seeing, in terms of this process and, what's on my social media. And, Sam, you were saying, well, like, it's this way now, and will it be that way in 6 months? And will I get my visas? But the other thing I'm also hearing, like, I'm hearing the anxiety from the kids, but I'm also hearing that in many ways, this is opening up a lot of choice and a lot of possibilities for kids. So there's an upside and a downside. Like, and when you think of like, the scale of the anxiety and then the choice, like where does that scale lie for you right now for the kids that you're seeing? Like, is the choice overwhelming? It's an opportunity, but choice can be overwhelming and anxiety producing. So where are you seeing like that opportunity and that kind of
Yeah.
cost to the kids, Sammy?
So I'm seeing actually, so there's less choice. I'm finding that, for
Mm.
example, in the past where students would apply to, different states across the US, now families are looking at states where they have relatives or family friends. They're thinking about how many flights from our current home. So, and I agree with Sam. A lot of this was post-COVID. They were looking, in case there was an emergency, how can I get to my kid as fast as possible? And so it's the first time they're thinking about like flight paths, right? And so what I'm seeing is even for our students who, are US nationals, they're being really selective, where in the US they're applying. So that's the first time I've seen that. So I think there's almost less choice now. Um, again, when this idea of the world is your oyster, you can apply globally. I find students are really starting to narrow it down. So, their focus might be Asia, and then within Asia, it might be like Hong Kong, Singapore, and Japan. And so, and I think that's important because it can be really overwhelming, you know, especially if
Yeah.
right? They have 10 plus application to the US, then they have, five to UCAS plus, and the list goes on, right?
And they're, full diploma students are doing their A
Yeah.
levels, at this, like it all hits them at the same time. I think
Yeah.
that's why I asked the question, Sam, like, what's your response to that, like choice versus impact on this
Is
individual
it
student?
Yeah, like a cost versus an opportunity kind of thing, right? I mean,
Yeah.
I think that they definitely have fewer choices in the US, but I think they actually
Mm.
opened up more choices. I think it's on for my students, it may be different from yours, Sammy, but it's
Right.
actually just like created just like and I think that's a positive thing overall, actually, in many ways. Even though there are a lot of not positive things happening in this reason why we've gotten here. But for my students, I think what it's done is it's really forced them to look beyond what used to be like a very traditional US UK option that I think a lot of college counseling offices have just because of our histories. And I think that's created opportunities for conversations a little bit more about what is a really good fit for a student, like culturally, or in terms of what they're actually looking for, in terms of long-term opportunities for them and careers. All of those things that we talk about with students, I actually think this has allowed us to like open some minds, whether it's the parents who needed a little bit more convincing or whether the students about all of the opportunities that are out there and approach it from a little bit more of an open-minded way. So I think that's one of those things where even though we have fewer opportunities and options, and it's obviously, especially for students who need financial aid or for students who are in situations where those US options were really important. I mean, that's not my student population right now, but it has been in the past. And I see that's devastating to a lot of students who really depended on those opportunities that aren't given elsewhere in the world at the same rate. But for my current population, it's just opened up, I think, different conversations for them.
Yeah.
Well, and this came from the class that the counseling class that I sat in on, because there were things that I didn't know about like the UCAS application, because I've been in mostly, I would say more, American style schools that had the IB program. But, in that American style school, it's extracurriculars and like being involved. And it was like, correct me if I'm wrong, but like it sounded like on the UCAS application, like those kinds of things weren't as important. So all of these things for so many of these kids who've been oriented towards like, let's say North America, you know, and being well-rounded and having the activities and da 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 da, and then they're like now reevaluating where they might go and like some of these things and they're all good for them. Like I'm not saying that they're not good for them, but we also know a lot of kids overdo it, and it adds a lot of extra onto their plate, and then they're applying into a new environment that they weren't planning on and applying, and then those things aren't part of the process anymore. Am I correct in that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And for a lot of those students who do a lot of the work applying to selective, highly selective schools, all the supplementary essays, I always tell them if they're thinking North America, if they're thinking the US, consider Canada because the application is very straightforward. And you can apply to, 5 schools in Ontario in less than 45 minutes, right? I mean, you don't have to know the schools you're applying to, but there's about 100 schools in Canada, right? 100 public institutions. And so I always say you're doing all this extra work. So now you can also consider scholarships, right? Because the scholarships will ask for essays and letters of recommendation. You have all those, that you've done all that for the US application. So that's something that a lot of students are considering. They've considered Canada as an option, especially if they're applying to the United States.
I'm surprised that more of my students aren't considering Canada, to be honest. It's been like fairly consistent in my school over the past few years. Some of my previous schools, we sent 40% of kids to Canada, but it's stayed pretty consistent here. And I'm wondering if that's going to change actually, now that you say that. But going
Well,
back
so
to
let
your
me,
questions,
yeah, go ahead.
Stacey, about like the being involved versus super curricular. We have a lot of those conversations right now with our students because of the shift that we're seeing and because of the pressure that they're under. We've tried to make that part of our conversations with families now as they're going into the IB diploma program and saying, maybe you've heard from your friends or your peers about, what your kid needs to do to get into college. And actually, we need to talk about that because um, some of them have been pushing their kids to do things based on this idea of what they need that they didn't even realize they didn't they don't need it all because they're, Australians who are going to go to Australia, or they are, really looking at Canada or looking at the UK. And so there's those misconceptions also floating out around there for us, for counselors to try and educate. And as the shift happens, if the majority of students are shifting to different destinations that have different entry requirements or have different application components, our counseling programs and lessons and things we do will also shift and change, because we're ultimately supporting students in planning their time and
I
taking
was
care of their
just going to ask,
well-being.
I was just going to ask you both, like, how do you professionally keep up with this?
Yeah, I mean, the conferences are great. I think it's almost you have to attend at least one or two international conferences annually, right? And then the webinars, and try to get as many visitors in to to the school. We've been hosting fairs. That's something we're expanding. We started something last year called the Senior Retreat, where we had seniors, instead of attending classes, they attended sessions held by admissions reps, and it was a full day dedicated to that work. Um, and so, yeah, as many connections as you can make, webinars. Yeah, LinkedIn is great way to just connect. Yeah.
Yeah, I think like the world right now is just all about constant learning and upskilling in general, with the rate at which things are changing in every sphere. But in ours, yeah, it's definitely like that. Conferences are so helpful, not only because of the sessions and the updates that we get annually, but just because of the connections we make. Just like you said, Sammy. I mean, we met at a conference, and now I'm like, I know I have someone I can ask a question to who knows more than I do about another area. And every connection that you make, I think more than so many other maybe teaching roles in schools, counselors connect with people across different networks, different countries, because we sometimes sit in a little silo, right, in our schools. We don't have an entire department of other English teachers or science teachers to ask questions to. We've got to have that network. We've got to connect with one another.
And are you both, just for your roles, are you specifically only college counselors, or are you general counselors who also college counts? Like you're doing the SEL side and the college counseling side?
Yeah, I'm both. I'm comprehensive, so I do social emotional and university college counseling.
And what
I
about you?
applaud. Yeah, I applaud you, comprehensive counselors. No, I am the head of college counseling. So I have a team of college counselors, and we just focus on college and career. But we are part of a bigger system that does focus on, pastoral care, and we work very closely with the other roles. But our focus is a little bit more academic and college career.
It just makes me wonder if schools are going to have to respond with more specialization, given how much you have to know and how much you have to kind of consume and manage and direct kids in the right way. It does make me wonder if this might be, and this is really my next question, like it makes me wonder, is this a longer term implication in schools, is that could lead to more specialization, in counseling? Like, what do you see as some of the longer term implications of these shifts and changes that we're experiencing, like in the shorter, more immediate term? But when you look out 3, 5, 10 years, like what are some of the things that you think might be permanent changes or things that might evolve out of this? Like, Sammy, let's start with you this time.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I have, I've had colleagues where they've made the shift from comprehensive to, a split or complementary model, just based on data and needs. I know we've talked about it at our current school, just because now as a comprehensive counselor, you're also working closely with like learning support specialists, safeguarding, and so it gets really tricky, and there's a lot of competing demands. And so we've talked about that, and we're currently collecting data to help us inform our decision making moving forward. Yeah.
Yeah. Sam, what do you
Our
see as some
school,
of the longer term implications of all of this?
yeah, I mean, our office already just in the past few years has grown. We never had that necessarily split, but we did have growth from, this idea of, and I still think this is still the case in a lot of traditionally like very British schools of, oh, that head of sixth form does UCAS, but now that it's
Right.
not just like doing UCAS, and it's not just as cut and dry. It's like, oh, actually one of the big needs of our families is guidance, right? Is feeling like they have someone to talk to about their futures and about what that means and about how their identity and the political situation or how their family goals and how finance and how all of that fits together. And so our office grew just because we wanted to be able to give that more personalized service. But I also see a trend in this change away from it just being we're college counselors or we're comprehensive counselors. And I see names shifting to things like future pathways. I'm trying to be more inclusive and open up that what we do isn't really just, help you apply to college. It's really that support on figuring out what life is like beyond school. And that encompasses so many different things.
Yeah,
Well, and I think go ahead, Sammy.
yeah, I said we've shifted our language from, college, university counseling to post-secondary, pathway planners. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and yeah, we have a focus and emphasis around, gap years, helping you plan your gap year, whether it's, you're doing a year off for military training. Like it's really, we're trying to be as inclusive as possible for to support all students.
Yeah,
Well, and I
same
do
with
think,
us.
generally speaking, because of, an increasing focus on social emotional learning,
Yeah.
behavior supports, pathways, I feel like in a school, like your role might be under the biggest degree of shift and
Hmm.
change, whether it's more coming on people without the support or increasing support or changing models. I mean, that's what I've seen in the past, like 4 years. Like, I feel like there's just a lot of reconceptualization of what it means to have a team supporting wellness and planning, future planning in a school. It's really undergoing a shift. Would you agree?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot more conversations around it, and again, it looks different in every school environment, right? Depending on the roles and responsibilities of the counselor. And yeah, I find the comprehensive model challenging at times. Again, because of the competing demands,
Right.
and I think it's just important to collect that data to ensure that you can provide the best services for your families.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I don't
right.
think
And
I
being very
mentioned
student-centered. Go ahead, Sam.
I don't think I mentioned this before, but it just made me think of it that I started out as a college counselor. I'm one of those few people who's never like I've always done future pathways planning. I've never been a teacher. I've never done anything else. It's what I've always done while I've worked in education. And then I was like, wow, counselors do so much. I'm going to do my master's in counseling and international counseling psychology to be a social emotional counselor. So I could do comprehensive. And about halfway through my master's while I was working as a college counselor, I was like, wow, I'd have to do both of these at the same time. So I was doing my practicum and I was like, oh my gosh. So yeah, that's why I say hats off to you because I always say I like that I have that skill set and I have the ability to support the
Yeah.
counselors, but I like that my focus gets to be a little bit on the other side. So
And I find it really difficult to be highly effective at both, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Well, I
It's
mean, I've
easy.
been in a school that split its model and
Hmm.
and made that shift. And that came as part of our social emotional learning, work and looking at those systems to best support kids. And it was a slow and hard process because you know, I think is you want your college counselors to know the kids for a long time as well. Like that's the benefit of a comprehensive model. But then, again, it's like the two sides of that role have gotten so big on each side. How do you effectively do both? I just say more counselors. That's what I say. Like, can we
Yeah.
hire more counselors? That's the answer. But that's not always easy for schools to do, right? Is to just add more personnel because we all work within like financial constraints, no matter where we are, whether they're high financial constraints or low financial constraints, they exist. If you had one thing that you wanted to share with people who are supporting these kids, who are navigating this right now, like the teachers, the parents, the administrators, from your perspective, and Sam, we'll start with you, and then Sammy, you can have the final word. Like, what would you say to people to really center on and think about what these kids are managing and going through as they try and navigate this, like increasingly feels like high stakes next choice in their trajectory?
Such a hard such a hard question. I mean,
it's when you get to see, you can
okay.
grab your soapbox and tell us what you believe. This.
I know one thing to say. I guess if I were to frame this a little bit differently is like what things do I think are important for people to come back to right now, in terms of ideas when they're supporting students who are like in this current environment and making all these decisions is these ideas of having both like fit and flexibility kind of live together and realizing that they're living in a time of great uncertainty and we all are. But we can look at that also as a part of the plan, not necessarily like a disruption to the plan. And what I mean by that is going back to that master's that served me. Planned happenstance, right? When you think about careers not being linear and that they unfold, and sometimes the students who do the best long term are the ones with the most rigid 5-year plan, and that we in general right now have to embrace adaptability and embrace this kind of shift and everything that's happening. And we can also do that by supporting students with these choices. I also think this might be unrelated. Again, stop me if I'm on a tangent. But when we think about the future, we're thinking about what skills students are building. We've got like the skills-based economy versus this knowledge economy. And so when we're thinking about skills and we're thinking about the skills that students need of like flexibility and adaptability and all of those things that they want, how are we helping them be able to adapt to these situations, and to take all of that's happening in the world right now as maybe part of the plan.
Part of the plan. Thank you, Sam. Sammy, last word.
Yeah, I'm thinking, it really does take a village, and I think it's really all of the educators. It's all of our role to, support our students through this process. And that means, educators sharing their stories, their squiggly career stories, just finding different opportunities for other members to develop that collective efficacy, to get involved, right? And to support our learners. Um, there's times where we'll organize events to, expose our students to different schools or different regions. And sometimes teachers are like concerned about their instructional time. And again, I think we just need to come together, because it's a really stressful and time for these students. And the more, trusted adults, the more support they have, the better they'll be. And I think also within that, I really believe in like, integrating everything into the curriculum. So, the first 2 years, 9 and 10, really should be like a lot of inside work, self-awareness, opportunities for students to learn about themselves, their needs, their values, their interests, their strengths. And counselors alone can't do that work. Again, we all have to be doing that work together with our students. And really helping students make decisions based on their values. And that's something I'm seeing more and more now. I think, students are thinking about their identities, thinking about environments where they're going to be safe, where they can be themselves, where they could find their people, where they can be visible,
Yeah.
where they can, where their voices are heard and valued. And I think that's something that's really important. And so, ensuring that that's a part of the process. And knowing that that's going to look completely different for every student. And if it looks the same, we're not doing it right.
Right. Well, again, I want to thank you both so much for your time. This is a conversation I've wanted to have for a while, and I could stay here a whole lot longer and ask you more questions, but I appreciate the time. I appreciate your perspective, and I appreciate the work that you're doing for kids to help them make that next best choice for them. So thank you so much. Kudos to you.
Thank you, Stacey.